Hello and welcome to the 7th episode of Out of Place But Effective. Today we're looking at America's Goodwill tanks. As you can notice, the Sherman's green looks slightly off. Why is that? Well, let's fire. Hello Panzer IV, you're gonna die now. It's Russian. America put out a lot of different vehicles to Russia, to Britain, and to her colonies. So, what did these vehicles do and how did they respond to? We'll start with Russia and then move on. In Russia, many of the Shermans posed some interesting effects. So, when they were first introduced, the Russians used them sparingly in individual tank units and, well, as little as they could. But near 1942, the M4 76 variant formed the entire strength of the 5th Mechanized Corps. Several more Mechanized Corps and Tank Corps were entirely equipped with the type by the end of the war. Now that tells you something. Well, the Russians may by Stalin's will not want to mention the fact that they were used by. They were using other nations' tanks, especially capitalist nations. The fact that the entirety of the 5th Mechanized Corps was using Shermans says something. So that tells me the vehicle saw a lot of use. But what other vehicles did the Russians receive? Well, they received Stuarts, which they've used. A lot of crews liked them, but, well, the very biggest problem was they were higher, but still were better than the T series, so the T60s, T70s, and T80s. Because the first Shermans were seen, going back to Shermans, the first Shermans were seen in 1943 and initially mainly issued to independent tank regiments to ease logistics, to make it easier. And that was straight from Allied tanks of the Second World War, 1939 to 1945, David Porter. And though they were not suited to the conditions as the T-34, which is kind of laughable since the thing didn't have a freaking heater in Russia. Several of its crews died to freaking hypothermia, but that's not since the point. The Sherman's mechanical reliability was appreciated. Because here's the thing. Russian mechanics were tired. German mechanics just needed one on every vehicle. Because Russian mechanics always had something to fix. But there's only one vehicle that almost everyone agreed they hated, even the Americans. What was this? Well, this was the ever-loving M3 Lee. There's something I'm looking for. Russian crew. It doesn't matter what you think. Did I miss? I missed it. But the reason the M3 Lee was so hated was because it was, well, both the British and the Russians agreed that it had a high silhouette, and they hated the thing for its high silhouette. Sitting at 10 feet, yeah, and it was vulnerable. Many Russian crews nicknamed it the Coffin for 7 Brothers. Because, well, that's what happened. The M3 light tanks that were from the British stocks, but were still American, were effective, but still weren't going to fill the gap for what they needed, because it's easier if you can make it at home. The only reason they got as many Shermans as they did is because they requested them. But as you can see, there's the M3 Lee. The most commonly known is the trucks, being GM trucks. There were also British vehicles sent over. This is being the weirdest one, a British converted Matilda. And the Russians liked most vehicles that were sent them besides the M3, but their most favorited isn't actually here. It was the British Valentine, but that was just because it worked well with Russian doctrine. As for the British did get a lot of American vehicles, because as you can see, we've got Stuarts here, 1 and 3s. We've got Shermans. Pretty cool. We've even got their own version of the Lee, the Grant. The biggest difference being that it was a different turret entirely. Both of them were still equally disliked. But the reasons the British used them so much was, well, they were better than what they had at the time. So, some of the M3s were modified to be these Grant variants, simply just giving them better turret room and actually reducing their silhouette. Because they didn't like that top cupola, as we see removed on this Grant. And they first saw action without the cupola in May 1942, when a total of 167 of them engaged in action at Gazla. I definitely butchered that. And by October 1942, a total of 210 Lees and Grants were in use. But this brings me back to... That's funny. It was other things. They weren't just sent to the Russians and the British. They were also sent to other countries like Australia, China, and Canada. Everyone liked the Sherman, even the British. Although it is stated in some literature that I have found, that I have not confirmed, that a lot of British Sherman crews would turn off the stabilizer. Many reasons being that the crews were not willing to waste the service on keeping the stabilizers maintained. They would also remove the 50 cals, but that was British High Command saying they didn't need them. And also, a lot of British students didn't use 50 caliber ammunition, so that means it's a little bit harder on logistics getting that 50 caliber ammunition out there. And British doctrine was not wanting tanks to move and shoot. It was stop, steady gun, fire, move, and so on and so forth. That's what gave them the ability. But the Canadians and the Canadians and the Australians did like the Sherman so much, as I stated earlier with the Ram and the Sentinel. They acted like Shermans, and were the availability of doing what they could. The Canadians also did develop a vehicle called the Grizzly, which was pretty much a Sherman look-alike. But that's what we can look at. The Chinese were a different story. I don't have much information on how the Chinese reacted to American-made vehicles. As you can see, they used the American-made M8, which saw a lot of combat. They also used the LV-ET, which is basically a transport. They probably also used the transport variant. They used the M3, the M10, and the M5 Stuarts, as well as the M24 and the Sherman. The M4, or A4 Sherman, was actually one of the Sherman models that was the Americans' outsourced model. Because here's the funny thing. When the Americans made it to France, specifically Paris. This Sherman, the M4A4 Sherman, was there on American crews. Actually not American crews, with French crews inside. Because as we know, these French crews made it to Britain and then were there as fighting. So the funny thing though, when these French crews made it to Paris, finally making it back home, being able to have their home back, they were treated as outsiders because they were in an American tank with American units. They were so confused by they say, but we're French, this is home, and they were actually treated very good by the French, even though they were their own people. But it was simply what they could do. And something funny about going back to the M3 Lee, the Ram, yeah, my apologies, is actually based on the M3 chassis. So we look at that, and we look at that, see, same rivets on the front. So the Ram was more similar to the Grant or the Lee than the Sherman, but it still did effective. The Grizzly was a version of the M4A1 Sherman, or Sherman 2, as we see here. It was made to British and Canadian standards, included a 2-inch smoke mortar, because very few Shermans actually had the ability to use smoke besides smoke shells. Da-da-da. Yeah, and it was what the British and Canadians wanted out of a tank compared to what the Americans wanted. Because while the Americans did share and do the Arsenal of Freedom, the tank did not fit what they needed for the Sherman-wise, because it wasn't fast enough, it was just too slow to do what they needed. But still, they had good outlooks. The Stuarts and Shaffies were what we're seeing more in combat, even though the Shaffies aren't here. The Stuarts made it all the way to the end of the war, used as scout tanks as well as the Sherman. That's pretty much all I have for this episode. I know it's a little shorter than the rest, but I'm making up for the last episode where I went way almost over time. So please do come back for the next episode, which is Grand Theft Tank. We're going to see some stolen tanks. You might have already spotted them when I was showing some stuff off. But we'll be talking about mostly Germany and Russia. I'll see you then.